So it's my pleasure to introduce Nate Veldt this morning. So Nate's a sixth-year student with me at the moment, and he has done a set of fantastic research that he's going to tell you about. But I wanted to start with a slightly different type of introduction. So I think I can safely say that Veldt's research has actually taken him further than any other student I've ever worked with. And so there's a number of ways you can interpret this statement. But lest my other students in the audience be wondering, I actually mean that quite literally in this case. So here is a picture of Nate doing some applied research in Margaret River, Australia. And for those of you who don't recognize this, this of course is a torus, which we have a representative of this morning, which is an orientable surface. Inscribed in this torus is in fact a non-orientable Mobius strip. And so this, of course, Margaret River, Australia, is 11,152 miles away from Lafayette Airport. And we, around that area, we took a few random walks, and so we happened to run into Markov Place at some point. This is an inside joke for all you mathematicians. Markov was the guy who popularized random walks. And we did find a few reminders of home, too. So here's the Boilermaker House in Melbourne, Australia, which is 9,687 miles away. And of course, who could forget Bar Lafayette in Perth, Australia, which is 11,046 miles away. And so, of course, we had to make sure to check. Cities on the other side of the world from West Lafayette. So in case you guys don't know about this, if you take a point in the globe and you actually managed to drill all the way through, what you would find is that the closest city to the other side of the world, so the other side of the world is in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but the closest city to the other side of the world is Port-au-Francis, somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I've never heard of this place. It's there. I don't imagine any of us will ever probably go there. However, if you look at the next two cities, Margaret River is the third closest city to the other side of the world from Western Australia, from West Lafayette. And in fact, we actually got about halfway between Margaret River and Augusta, which is the second. And so here we have Nate doing a little bit of research on projective geometry. There's a particularly nice shadow on the side of this tree.
But the distances don't seem right. The Earth is bigger than that, isn't it?
This is the distance from the antipode. So the distance from the actual point on the other side of the world.
Yeah, like through the Earth, but still.
No. So take West Lafayette, go all the way to the other side of the world, and this is how far you are away from that. So again, neither of these are particularly close, I guess but roughly speaking, it's about equidistant. So I'm pretty confident that Nate's record, as far as going the furthest, is going to stand for quite some time here. Maybe tied in the near future, but probably not going to be exceeded while I'm a professor. And so with that, I will turn it over to Nate to tell you a lot more about optimization for graph clustering.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go ahead and close this door here. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I really I'm honored by the fact that you'd spend 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning coming here to listen to me talk about optimization frameworks for graph clustering. Sorry. Is it a little bit too dark?
Too bright, I think.
Too bright?
I think it'll brighten up in a second.
I hope so. How's that for a first slide? All right, so we're jumping right in here. So I'm going to talk about optimization frameworks for graph clustering. And I want to clear the air a little bit. I know when I say the word graph, a few of you may potentially be picturing these things right here. And we're not going to be talking about these today because these are what I will refer to as plots or figures. So when I say that I'll be talking about graph clustering today, what I mean by a graph is the following thing. A graph is essentially a way to model a set of data objects that are interconnected by pairwise relationships. And so I'm going to use the term networks synonymously. And here on this slide right here, there are a lot of different examples of what a network can be in the real world. So you can think of social networks, you can think of transportation networks like airline networks, brain networks, biological networks, etc. So networks and graphs, this is what we're talking about today. And specifically within the world of network science and graph theory, I have been doing a lot of research on graph clustering. So graph clustering is also referred to as community detection because the goal is you're seeking communities of nodes in a graph or a network. So for example, right here, this is what's called a collaboration network. So every node in this graph over here represents an academic researcher. And there's an edge between two nodes if they have collaborated on a paper specifically on the topic of network science. And here is a community of researchers in the network science graph. I'm having a little bit of trouble with the clicker. So here's the basic definition of a community for the task of community detection. In order for a set of nodes to be a community, you want a lot of edges between nodes inside the community, so a lot of edges between red nodes, but not many edges leaving the community and going to the rest of the graph. So I'm going to call these two properties internal density and external sparsity, and you want both of these things in order to find communities in a graph. And so I'm going to be telling you about some of the algorithmic techniques and mathematical results I've developed for graph clustering. But before we jump into the math, I want to show you a few pictures, and we want to talk about just a little bit where graph clustering arises in some applications and why people would care to study this from a mathematical perspective. So I'm going to start with a really kind of classic bread and butter community detection experiment that network scientists love to poke at. So this is a 34-node network that represents interactions between members of a karate club that was studied back in the 1970s. So Wayne Zachary was someone who looked at this karate club. Every node in this graph is a member of a karate club, and an edge between two members indicates that they shared some type of social interaction outside of the activities of the club. And what's interesting is while Wayne Zachary was studying this karate club, there was actually a lot of internal political conflict going on between the karate instructor, node number 1, and the president of the club, node number 34. And the conflict was so severe that eventually the karate instructor broke off and formed his own karate club around all these members here. And there was a split across this dotted line right here. So interestingly, if you take some of the tools that I've developed and you set your parameters correctly, you can actually get the following split of this community using one of my algorithms. The algorithm forms a blue cluster and a green cluster, and it almost exactly matches how the two parties eventually split. And the only two exceptions here are a couple nodes on the border. Node number 10 is a node that Wayne Zachary identified as someone who didn't really care about the political schism, was neutral. And the interesting thing about node number 9 was node number 9 actually agreed with the president in the political debate that was happening, but he was 3 weeks away from getting his karate black belt, so when the club split in two, he felt compelled to go with the instructor so he didn't have to start from scratch again on his karate black belt. So this is just kind of a fun little example of a graph and something that network scientists like to look at for community detection, but there are also other bigger examples and other applications people care about. So here's another application, classifying handwritten digits. In this graph of about 3,000 nodes, every node represents a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. This is a handwritten digit written by various different people wrote down digits. And if you draw edges between different nodes based on a certain way to measure similarity scores between the handwritten digits, then you get this graph, and if you perform clustering on it, the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s all correspond to different communities of nodes in the graph. And if you use one of the tools that I'll tell you about today, you can actually get roughly, go back here, a 99% accuracy rate of putting the 1s with the 1s, 2s with the 2s, 3s with the 3s, and 4s with the 4s. And so another example where finding communities in graphs can be useful for a certain application. So here's another application from biology. Biologists also apply clustering techniques pretty frequently. And so specifically, this is a graph where every node represents a gene in a yeast organism. And there's an edge between two genes if they have a very high correlation in something called a microarray expression experiment. So this experiment was performed. The genes get expression values. If there's high correlation between expression values for different genes, there's an edge in the graph. And interestingly, if you look at clusters in this graph, they often correspond to sets of genes that are associated with the same biological function or attribute. So all of these genes right here are associated specifically with functions that go on in the nucleus of a cell. And 5 out of 6 of these genes are associated specifically with the transportation biological process. And the reason this is significant is because of the 6,433 genes in the yeast organism, only 1.7% of them participate in the transportation biological process. And so graph clustering has brought together a statistically significant subset of these transportation genes. Okay. One more application. I have a lot of fun with this one. So let's say you take your favorite cat picture and you want to segment this image. You can perform image segmentation using tools from graph clustering. So the idea is you take a picture and you associate every tiny pixel in this picture with a node in a graph. And then you draw edges between nodes in the graph based on some measure of similarity. So the pixels are spatially close to another, and they have similar brightness scores. And you can construct a graph where you can see the outline of the cat. And if I zoom in here, you can see that this is just nodes and edges. And if you cluster this with some of the tools I'll tell you about, you can identify the outline of the cat, and the algorithm starts to also partition different pieces of the cat as well. Okay? We'll come back to this one actually in a few slides down the road. So these are just a sample of places where people use graph clustering. And we could talk about applications all day, but we want to start moving into mathematical formalizations. So what people tend to do when they're performing graph clustering, or one very common technique, is to cast graph clustering as a mathematical optimization problem. So this is what I mean by that. You have some objective function f that can take as input any clustering of a graph. And then once you have your mathematical objective function, which by the way needs to encode your two goals of graph clustering, form clusters that are internally dense and externally sparse. So you find some function that does this, and then you take any clustering of some network you care about, and then you can use this function to output some score that tells you how good or how bad your communities are in this particular clustering. And then in optimization, the goal is to find either the minimum or the maximum value of this objective function, depending on what function it is. So I say depending on what function it is because there are actually a lot of different objectives for graph clustering that have been introduced and been studied by people before. And so here's just a sample of some of the names. Maximum modularity clustering, sparsest cut clustering. There's a really long list of objectives people have studied. And one way to understand what's going on with the plethora of different approaches is they're all sort of striking a different type of a balance between your two goals in graph clustering. So they all, to some degree or another, want to form clusters with external sparsity and internal density. But these two things kind of conflict, and you need to find a right trade-off. And all of these objective functions are sort of looking for a different type of a balance between these goals. Okay. So let's look specifically at a couple of these objectives right now, and I'm going to illustrate what the answer is for them, or the optimal solution on just this toy graph right here. On one end of the spectrum, we've got something called sparsest cut. So sparsest cut always forms two clusters. I'll call one S, and everything that's not an S is an S bar, the complement set. And so if you minimize this ratio-like objective, the cut of S divided by the size of the set, plus the cut of S divided by the size of S bar, cut is just the number of edges between the two groups. Minimize this, and you get the following output, two clusters in this toy graph. On the other end of the spectrum, moving the direction of forming dense clusters, there's an objective called cluster deletion. And so in cluster deletion, what you want to do is cut or delete the fewest number of edges in your graph in order to partition it into completely connected subgraphs. So these are called cliques. So in this example right here, you can see that everyone's friends with everyone in these little clusters right here. Instead of forming two, we formed 5, and they're all very dense. And one more I want to just briefly look at. Modularity is a very popular objective for community detection. It lies somewhere between sparsest cut and cluster deletion. And I don't want to go into the mathematical details. I mean, here's the technical definition of it. Informally, modularity is sort of a measure of the number of internal edges inside of your clusters, minus a measure of how many internal edges you would expect to see, where expectation is measured with respect to some random null model. Okay, so lots of objectives for graph clustering. This problem has been studied for decades, ripping apart a graph into pieces. And so what are the challenges? Why is it that I've still been spending years doing research on it? So I want to motivate that question with a small example right here. This is a 100-node synthetic data set. This is not a real-world network, but it's a 100-node fake data graph that has been explicitly constructed to have community structure. There are 3 ground truth clusters, and the edges have been drawn in such a way that 70% of the edges are inside the communities and 30% are between communities. So this has significant community structure. So what if I don't know what the communities are and I want to find them? I could try optimizing the modularity objective, because it's really popular, right? People have used this a lot. So if I run modularity, and I optimally solve it on this graph, this is the solution that I get. Modularity completely fails to, it detects one cluster just fine, but it tears this cluster apart into all sorts of different pieces, and it doesn't get the right solution, despite the fact that it's widely used and it's very popular. And so this highlights one major challenge in graph clustering, which is that oftentimes mathematical models or objective functions for graph clustering don't always map well to community structure in different applications and contexts. And even if there is a good objective function out there, it's not always easy to find what is the best one to use. And another major challenge is, even if you have a great model for community detection and you have a really good objective function, these are NP-hard to optimize in practice. And if you haven't heard the word NP-hard, you can just translate this as hard. So on this graph right here, it actually took 14 hours to optimally solve modularity. And I'm not talking on a laptop. This is on a lab machine with 512 gigabytes of RAM and 28 cores working furiously. It still took it 14 hours. And so the resulting needs in graph clustering research is that we need general and flexible algorithms and methods for graph clustering, objective functions, and we also need rigorous and scalable ways to deal with this intractability problem. And usually that takes the form of algorithms that will not solve your problem optimally, but will get a good approximation with nice theoretical guarantees. And so all of this has sort of been lead up to actually what I'm going to talk about in terms of new research. So I'm going to be telling you specifically a lot about a new optimization framework called Lambda correlation clustering that I've developed in my work. And the benefits of Lambda correlation clustering is it's general. A lot of other algorithms, or a lot of other objective functions can be viewed as special cases. It also comes with new algorithms and some interesting applications that we'll get to during the talk. Okay, so the name of the framework is Lambda correlation clustering. And before explaining what Lambda correlation clustering is, I first have to introduce correlation clustering. So correlation clustering is an objective function, or it's a framework for partitioning signed data sets. So in the most basic case, you have some graph where every two nodes has either a positive edge, indicating the nodes are similar and want to be clustered together, or they have a negative edge indicating they're dissimilar and they want to be clustered apart. So given this type of input, correlation clustering wants to find the way to split up the graph into clusters in a way that will minimize the number of mistakes. And so a mistake in this case can take on one of two forms. If I put two enemies together, two nodes that have a negative edge, in the same cluster, I've made one mistake. Or if I take two friends and split them apart, that's a different way to make a mistake. Okay, and in the standard unweighted version of correlation clustering, these come with an equal penalty. In lambda correlation clustering, this is a generalization in which you still want to avoid making mistakes, but you penalize the two different types of mistakes in an unequal manner. So specifically, you set a resolution parameter lambda, and if you make one type of mistake where you put enemies together, you make a penalty of weight lambda. And if you separate friends, this comes with a penalty of 1 minus lambda. And as lambda changes from 0 to 1, how you want to cluster this graph changes. Now I want to pause for a second. I was talking about graph clustering on just standard unsigned graphs for a bit, and now all of a sudden we're talking about graphs with positive and negative edges. So a natural question at this point is, how does lambda correlation clustering, which is defined on signed graphs, apply to this community detection problem I started talking about? And so here is the basic pipeline. Let's say you have your favorite 5-node graph, or hopefully a bigger graph that you're interested in finding communities in. What you can do to find communities in this standard network is you can introduce some value of a resolution parameter, lambda, and convert this into a sign graph by interpreting an edge over here as a positive edge in the sign graph, and the absence of an edge as a negative edge in your sign graph. And then you partition this with respect to correlation clustering, and then you get a partition of your original network as well. And importantly, this value of lambda controls a certain type of trade-off. In the sign graph, the trade-off you're controlling is I want positive edges inside clusters, and I want negative edges between clusters. But what this translates to in your unsigned version is exactly the set of goals for graph clustering we've been talking about. You want internal density and external sparsity, and the value of your parameter lambda is controlling this balance. Okay. So this is a flexible framework because lambda controls a balance between internal density and external sparsity. And interestingly, it also generalizes a lot of other objectives. So I'm going to walk through a couple results to show you why sparsest cut and cluster deletion actually can be captured just as special cases of this new general lambda CC framework. Okay. So let's look at sparsest cut first. So correlation clustering in general, you can form as many clusters as you want. You can make as many communities. But for simplicity at first here, I'm just going to consider what happens if you only form 2 clusters. So I've got a small graph right here. And I've split it into S on the left and S bar on the right. And I want to compute what is the weight of mistakes, what is the objective function score for lambda CC. And so I can compute the weight of positive mistakes. That's the number of edges, positive edges crossing between these two things, times their weight. This is 1 minus lambda times the cut. And if you do some algebra, you can eventually convince yourself that the weight of negative mistakes, those 2 lambdas inside there, can also be expressed in terms of lambda and in terms of the cut, etc. And to make a long story short, if you add these 2 types of mistakes together, you can eventually reach this objective function for 2-cluster lambda correlation clustering. So now we're viewing this as an optimization problem where I'm looking for a set S that minimizes this penalty score right here, the lambda correlation clustering score. So let's say I fix a lambda, and then I minimize this, and then I check the first 2 terms. If these first 2 terms, which are the only terms that depend on the value of what S is, if it's less than 0, I can perform a couple steps of algebra and rearrange this to see that this ratio score, cut divided by the product of the sizes of the sets, is less than lambda. And the reason why this is significant is because this ratio score right here is a scaled version of the sparsest cut objective that we saw earlier. So if you take this ratio objective, multiply it by the number of nodes in the graph, you get the sparsest cut score. So when the title of my slide says lambda CC is the decision version of sparsest cut, what that means is if I fix some lambda and optimally solve this objective here, this will answer the question, is there some set that has sparsity less than lambda times the number of nodes in the graph? Okay, and so there's this inherent relationship between sparsest cut and the cluster deletion objective. And this relationship also holds if you don't restrict to forming only 2 clusters. And so without going into the details, if you remove this restriction to only form 2 clusters, you can show as a generalization that the general lambda CC objective function can be written like this. You're optimizing this over different clusterings that have different clusters inside the clustering. And if you minimize this objective optimally, then you will produce clusters, all of which satisfy this ratio score being less than lambda. And furthermore, there exists some small value of lambda such that if you minimize this objective for that correct lambda that exists, then minimizing with respect to this objective function will produce the exact same clustering as you would get if you solved the sparsest cut objective. Okay, and so these 2 problems are related in that way. So this holds for small values of lambda. If you move in the direction of large values of lambda, this is where we see a connection to cluster deletion. So remember, cluster deletion, I want to cut edges and form cliques, groups of friends who all like each other. Right? This can be thought of as just a special version of correlation clustering, where negative edges, which correspond to non-edges in my original graph, have an infinite penalty. Okay? So if there's an infinite penalty on a negative edge mistake, I will never make a negative edge mistake because it's too expensive. Right? And so if I solve this with correlation clustering, I never make negative mistakes, which is to say over here I'm only forming cliques over here. In my clusters, everyone likes everyone. Okay? Now, how does this relate to lambda correlation clustering? Well, for lambda much larger than 1 minus lambda, this is just generalizing cluster deletion. And so to illustrate that, let's say, for example, lambda is 0.99. If you set lambda to be 0.99, it becomes 99 times more expensive to make a negative edge mistake than to make a positive edge mistake. Okay, and so you can imagine as I scale lambda closer and closer to 1, it becomes prohibitively expensive to make a negative edge mistake. And so it's as if I were in this situation, which is to say I'm solving cluster deletion. Okay, and you can make this more precise. This is sort of a hand-wavy proof, but the connection is precise and it's there. Lambda correlation clustering generalizes cluster deletion. Lambda correlation clustering generalizes cluster deletion exactly, is what I want to say. Okay, I mentioned modularity earlier, and lambda correlation clustering is also related to modularity. In order to see the relationship, there's actually a slightly different construction of the lambda CC framework. So in a degree-weighted version of lambda correlation clustering that I've studied with my co-authors, you set the weights of the edges not just with respect to the parameter lambda, but also with respect to the degree of each node. So it's the number of positive friends it has. So this has degree 3, 1, 2, 3. So if you use this construction and you set lambda appropriately, you can prove that minimizing lambda CC is equivalent to maximizing modularity. So there's a connection for this objective as well. And taking a step back, lambda correlation clustering generalizes and interpolates between a lot of different previous approaches for graph clustering. So I've talked about sparsest cut, cluster deletion. Cluster editing is sort of just the unweighted version of correlation clustering. And then for the degree-weighted version, I've mentioned a connection to modularity. And normalized cut is sort of just a degree-weighted version of sparsest cut. So they're related in that way. So this shows that lambda CC is a general new framework. So that's cool. This is a general framework. But what also is really interesting about studying lambda correlation clustering is that it comes with a lot of interesting new approximation guarantees. So here's what I mean by that. People have studied the unweighted version of correlation clustering pretty extensively. And currently the best algorithm, remember this is an NP-hard problem, which means the best algorithms that we know of to solve this optimally will take an exponential amount of work. So we would like to get good approximations doing only a polynomial amount of work. And so the best algorithm for the unweighted version is a 2.06 approximation, which is to say, even if I can't solve the problem perfectly, I can get a clustering that makes at most 2.06 times the minimum number of mistakes in polynomial time. Okay. So on the other end of the spectrum, if you let your weights be anything, because in correlation clustering you can assign a different weight for every one of these edges, you can still get an approximation algorithm, but the approximation factor isn't as good. It's an order log n approximation factor, okay, using similar techniques. And nestled between these two cases is this lambda CC version, which I've been working on studying new algorithms for. And it turns out that you can get approximation guarantees for this as well. Specifically, this is m is the number of edges in a graph. In this parameter regime, you're equivalent to cluster deletion, and we have a 2 approximation for this problem. And for any other lambda that's greater than a half, we can get a 3 approximation. And significantly, this 2 approximation for cluster deletion is now the best known approximation algorithm for the problem in the literature. Okay. So I don't want to dwell super long on details of approximation algorithms, but I want to at least give you a taste of what's going on with these methods and how they work. This is a binary linear program for lambda correlation clustering. It's an optimization problem so that if I solve this optimally, that would optimally solve lambda CC. And it has this variables xij, which are 0 and 1, depending on whether nodes ij are clustered together or clustered apart. I can't solve this in polynomial time, and so a relax and round algorithm is an algorithm that does the following. Replace this challenging binary constraint with the following linear constraint. You relax it so that xij can be anything between 0 and 1, and this will give you a distance between nodes I and j in your problem. So you've optimally solved a different problem, and this is good because if you replace this constraint with a linear constraint, you can now solve this linear program in polynomial time. But you've solved a different problem, and so then you have to round these xij's to turn them into 0s and 1s so that you actually get a clustering of your graph. Okay. So I don't want to dwell, again, not too long on the details, but we use a rounding approach that is sort of a generalization of something that was studied by researchers Van Zuylen and Williamson for the unweighted version of correlation clustering. And adapting some of their techniques, we can get approximation algorithms for correlation clustering. And I would love to stand here and talk to you about approximation algorithms all day, but I'm not going to. So that's all we'll say for now. So those algorithms come with nice approximation guarantees, but they're expensive. They take a lot of time. And so an alternative, if you want to do something a little bit quicker in practice, is to use greedy heuristics. And so in short, we also have some other algorithms that don't come with approximation guarantees, but they work in the following way. You start with every node in its own cluster, and then we're going to make moves between nodes and merge different clusters together as long as moving nodes around improves our objective function. And when I stop getting improvement in my objective function, I stop moving nodes around. Okay, and so for example, I can take a starter node, and if it's beneficial, I can add a neighbor. And if it continues to be beneficial, I add another neighbor. And I'm going to continue adding nodes based on whether or not this improves the objective function until I reach a point where the cluster says I'm stuffed, I can't handle another node. And if I have another node added to this cluster, I will make the objective worse instead of making it better. Okay? So this is an alternative to get faster approximations, but it doesn't come with as many nice theoretical guarantees. Okay, let's go back now to some applications. Why is it useful in practice to have this Lambda correlation clustering framework? So we're coming back to our favorite cat picture, and we've turned it into a graph, and now we're going to use Lambda correlation clustering to get different ways to cluster this graph in practice. And interestingly, this parameter lambda controls what type of an output I'm going to get. So I showed you this picture before. This is if I use a very tiny value of lambda. I identify the cat's left side of his face and the right side and the bottom side of its face. And as lambda starts getting larger, I actually start to identify more fine-grained features in the segmentation. So for this value of lambda, I've actually identified the cat's eyes. The algorithm just gravitated towards forming clusters around the eyes. And if I continue to partition this more and more, I just get more fine-grained features in the cat. And this is all controlled just by running the same algorithm, one of those heuristic methods, tuning your parameter lambda. Okay? And so this is probably the slide that I want you to take away if you don't take anything else from the rest of the talk. The main takeaway of this application in my talk is that there is in fact more than one way to cluster a cat, and Lambda CC can handle all of them. So you can go home and tell your friends that this is what you learned today in Nate's talk. And we get some nice Andy Warhol style art as well out. So that's a bonus application of my research. Okay, another application. So you can use lambda correlation clustering to study community detection in social networks. And so here's the following setup. Let's say you have a university social network, but you don't know who these people are. You just have metadata about them. So you know that a node is a male engineering student in Wiley with graduation year 2020. And if you cluster this with lambda correlation clustering, remember we're interpreting a non-edge as a negative edge of weight lambda, and lambda controls what type of communities identify as I change my parameter. And so there are actual data sets like this. They're called the Facebook 100 data sets that people study. And so every Facebook 100 network is a subset of Facebook at a university crawled back in September of 2005. And so here is a result from Cornell University. Before talking about the communities that I'm forming here as I change lambda, here are just some baseline facts about the network. If I randomly select two people from the Cornell Facebook dataset and check whether or not they're both students or both faculty, there's about a 60% success rate that they'll both share this student-faculty status. Okay? So this is just something about the network. 60% of the time, two randomly selected people will either be both students or both faculty. But now let's say I cluster the network first using lambda correlation clustering. As a matter of fact, cluster the network for a whole different range of values of lambda. What happens to the probability if I randomly select two people from the same cluster? And the probability spikes up a lot. And so what this is saying is for a small value of lambda, randomly select two people from the same cluster, there's a much higher percentage that they share the student-faculty status because the clustering is sort of bringing people together based on the edge structure that share metadata attributes in common. And the same trend also holds for the graduation year attribute and for the dorm attribute. And so these gaps between the baseline probability and the probability from selecting two people that share an attribute in a clustering indicates that there's a significant correlation between the types of communities that are in the network and the metadata attributes that we're seeing. Okay. And another interesting thing about this is if you run this experiment at different universities, you get the same type plot. And so specifically, for small values of lambda, you get a high peak for the student faculty status and the graduation year metadata attribute, whereas for the dorm attribute, when you move in the direction of forming smaller, denser communities, you see a spike in the relationship with the dorm attribute. And this kind of makes sense from a real-world intuition perspective. When you try to think of correlation between small, tight-knit communities and the type of friendships that form in a dorm setting, it's easy to imagine that, in a dorm setting, you have far more scenarios where you have a small group of people that all know each other really well versus a larger community setting where not every freshman knows every freshman, even though graduation year probably does influence community structure in one way or another. Okay? And so with a more static objective function, you wouldn't be able to cluster the graph with a whole different range of parameters and see different features of the community structure. Okay, one more application here. So another interesting thing about lambda correlation clustering is it helps answer a really hard question in graph clustering, which is, if I have a new application, how do I know which among the tons of objective functions I should actually use in practice? Okay, and so for this experiment, I took a 4,100 node collaboration network and a whole bunch of off-the-shelf graph clustering tools. And I clustered the same network with each one of these clustering tools. And that gives me one clustering. And then I can measure how well does that clustering optimize the lambda CC objective. And so what this curve here, this bowl-shaped curve, is illustrating is that if I care about small values of lambda, then it would be good for me to use the gray clustering algorithm. Whereas if I care about medium values of lambda, I might be better off just taking the existing infomap algorithm and just running that. And so what this figure is illustrating is that instead of asking the question, what method should I use, it suffices to ask the question, well, if I use lambda CC, what lambda should I use for my application? And if I can figure out the right lambda, I can then hopefully figure out a good approach for my application. Okay, so this figure is probably my favorite figure of all the ones that I've worked on during my time at Purdue. And it leads to a couple of interesting questions. So the first question is, okay, fine, what lambda should I use? Maybe I won't ask what method should I use, but you haven't answered the question, what lambda should I use? And the other question is, I kind of breezed past this, but in order to form this graph, the y-axis here is not the actual lambda correlation clustering score. You take a clustering, and then you divide it by a lower bound on the optimal score, where the lower bound is computed by solving an LP relaxation, okay? Which can be done in polynomial time, but for a 4,100 node graph, like the one I used in this experiment, this means repeatedly solving a linear program with 12 billion constraints. And even though that's polynomial time, it's a far cry from easy. So I actually don't have time to answer both of these questions today, as much as I would love to keep you for the rest of the day. So here's what we're going to do. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Choose Your Own Adventure books, where you're reading along and you reach a page and it tells you if you want to do this in the story, turn to page whatever. If you want to do that, turn to a different page. But actually my PhD dissertation is just the next book in the set of Choose Your Own Adventure stories. And so we're going to go by popular vote today. If you would like to learn about how to choose lambda in practice, we're going to go to slide 42. If you would like to learn how to solve the lambda CC LP relaxation, we'll go to slide 63. If you're having a hard time deciding and everyone needs to vote, then here are a couple things that you'll see if you go into these two directions. So I'm going to pause for a second because I really need a drink of water, let you ponder this, and we'll take a vote before we wrap things up in 10 minutes. Okay. So we can see pictures and animations and fix the synthetic experiment. Or talk about solving problems with up to 2.9 trillion constraints. Okay, we're going to take it to a vote. So we're going to do a rough eyeball vote here so we don't take too long. But how many people would be slightly more interested in learning how to choose lambda in practice? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. All right, how many people are interested in the second option here? All right, I see a slight favoring for this. And my committee members can feel free to grill me about the other direction. We will have time to go into that after everything else. But it seems like this slide 42 is slightly more popular, and so let's click on this. Congratulations, you chose how to choose Lambda in practice. Okay, here is the setup we're in. You have some new application, and I have convinced you that Lambda CC is the best thing since sliced bread, but you still need to figure out how to set Lambda in practice, right? And so what I'm going to ask you, if you are a practitioner asking me how to set Lambda in practice, I will say, can you give me at least one example of a clustering that seems right for your application? And so hopefully in practice, if someone has a situation or an application where they want to perform clustering, the hope is they may have some idea of what clusters look like, but they don't exactly know how to set parameters for our algorithm. So we're going to assume they've given us a clustering, and this is an inverse problem where we're asking, how do I learn a lambda based on what this clustering looks like? Okay. So I'm going to go back briefly to the figure that I showed you before and remind you that every one of these curves, these bowl-shaped curves, corresponds to a single clustering, and the minimum point on each of these curves tells me which lambda sort of fits that clustering best. Okay? And so this type plot will also show up for the example clustering that you have given me for your particular application. And actually, if you gave me any clustering of this small network, it would correspond to a different type of a bowl-shaped curve. Okay? So you give me a clustering, there's some bowl-shaped curve that goes along with it. And so this suggests the following strategy. Take your example clustering and try to find the minimum point on this curve, which will give you a lambda that corresponds to a lambda that's designed to produce clusterings like your example clustering. Okay? Now the caveat here is that I don't actually want to form this entire curve, because that involves repeatedly solving the lambda CC LP relaxation, which, even though there are some new techniques for it, is still challenging to do in practice. And so we want to find a way to find the minimum of this curve without forming the entire curve. And so this is a new type of optimization framework where I'm optimizing over the value of lambda based on a fixed clustering. So what is the function that I'm minimizing? What's the function that traces out this curve? Well, it's a ratio between two things. If I fix a clustering C, the numerator of this function is just the lambda CC objective score. Okay, and I've written it in general terms, but this is the weight of mistakes for lambda CC, and it's linear in lambda, if I think of lambda as the variable. And the denominator of this function is a lower bound on the optimal lambda CC objective function, which is determined by solving the lambda CC LP relaxation. And previous research has confirmed that linear programs of this form, which is called the parametric linear program, are concave and piecewise linear in the value of the parameter lambda. Okay. So I'm going to use properties of f and g to develop properties for my function p, which I'm calling the parameter fitness function, so that I can then minimize the parameter fitness function. And I'm not going to read this out. That'd be a little bit of a mouthful right now, but I just want to translate property 1 right here that I was able to prove. Essentially tells you that when you're trying to minimize this curve, once the curve goes up, it can't go back down again. So it may not be a convex curve. It may look something like this, but it's not going to look something like that. There are no local minima that you might get trapped in. Okay? So this makes it easier to minimize it. There are no tricky local minima. And the second property essentially tells me that there are no plateau flat regions that I could get caught in if I'm looking for the function. I'm not going to get caught wandering around a flat region. Okay? And so there are nice properties about these curves that will allow us to sort of find a good way to roll to the bottom and find the minimum of the curve. Okay, so using these two properties, we can develop a way to carefully sample values of this function, or this curve, in order to find the bottom of it. So let's say I have some unknown curve, and I've evaluated at 2 different values of lambda, and I get the output. Okay, I don't evaluate the whole curve. I evaluate it at 2 points. And at this point, I know that the minimizer can't be to the left of this because of the first property. Because I can't start down and go up and then go back down again. Okay? So the minimizer isn't over here. But at this point, it may be the case that my curve looks like this. It may also be the case that my curve looks like this. And I don't know which of those 2 scenarios I'm in, whether the minimizer is over here or the minimizer is over there. So what I do is I evaluate the function at a new point, at a new lambda between my other 2 previous lambdas. Okay? And since this is lower than the other 2 points, I now know that the minimizer cannot be to the right of the rightmost point, okay, because it can't go up and then down again. And so I've ruled out this possibility over here. Okay. And so I'm carefully honing in on where my minimizer is. And the second property tells me if I take my two values of lambda and they have the same output for the function, the exact same output, this just tells me that the minimizer is somewhere between the two, and so it rules out the possibility that it's somewhere far away over here. Okay. And so to make a long story short, you can use these properties to develop a bisection-like approach which will increasingly hone in on the minimum of your function. So the general idea is you evaluate it at two endpoints, then you evaluate it at a midpoint. In some cases, this will completely cut your search space in half. In other cases, you might find yourself in a situation where the midpoint is lower than the two endpoints, and you still don't know for sure if the minimizer is over here or over here. And so you sample the function, you evaluate it at another couple midpoints, and then this rules out the possibility that your minimizer is over in the right corner. And so by performing a small number of computations along this curve, I can increasingly cut off half of the space, and so I'm honing in on my minimizer closer and closer. So that's the basics of the algorithm. Okay. All right, so wrapping up here, how can we use this technique to fix this problem we had with this synthetic graph where modularity was doing the wrong thing? Well, remember that modularity is actually just a special case of lambda CC with a certain value of lambda. So let's try learning a different lambda and fix the problem. Okay. So we're going to assume that even though I don't know everything about this graph G, I'm in some application domain where I know something about a related problem. Okay, that's the assumption we have to start with. So say I have some G prime that's drawn from the same graph distribution, and I know the community structure here. And so I'm going to learn some parameter lambda using my bisection-like approach. So once I have this lambda prime, I can then apply one of my heuristic algorithms for lambda correlation clustering using the new lambda prime. And then doing this, we're able to capture the community structure for a certain class of graphs. So now we have a special lambda prime that is sort of specifically intended for clustering in this particular setting. And we can fix, we can fix our synthetic experiment that we previously screwed up using the modularity objective. Okay. So this is kind of just a quick illustration. We actually ran some numerical experiments on this. Here's another class of graphs where modularity tends to get things wrong pretty frequently. And so for this experiment, what I did, the parameter mu controls how easily detectable the community structure is. It controls the ratio of in-cluster edges. And so for a range of different mixing parameters, mu, we tested two approaches. One just using the modularity approach on 5 different networks. And the other approach is to take one network, learn a good value of lambda, and then test the clustering results on the 5 networks. So I have 6 networks. One I use to learn lambda, and the other 5 I use to do testing. And so this is what's called an ARI score, and what you need to know is that closer to 1 is better, 1 is perfect. And if we learn a lambda, we're always doing better than just using a vanilla off-the-shelf modularity approach that would have been used perhaps in previous work. Okay. And we are out of time with that, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap that up. Thank you very much.